Why, you listen to me. I don't care what you do once this thing's over with. You can lay down and die and rot in the street.
4 generations of television viewers. One name conjures instant warmth. Hoss Cartwright. He was the biggest of the Cartwright brothers on Bonanza, and somehow also the softest. He was slow to anger, quick to laugh, and always the first to defend someone smaller than him. Millions of people who never met Dan Blocker, the actor who played him, felt like they knew him personally. And in a strange way, they did, because Dan Blocker didn't so much play Hoss Cartwright as pour himself into the role. Now, decades after his death, his son Dirk Blocker, himself a working actor for over 50 years, has spent recent years speaking more openly about his father than he ever did before. Not a scandal, not a hidden identity, something quieter and, in its own way, more powerful. A confirmation of who Dan Blocker really was when the cameras stopped rolling. That the gentle giant on screen wasn't a performance at all. It was simply Dan, turned slightly outward for the world to see. To understand why that confirmation matters, you have to go back to the beginning, to a small Texas town, an oversized baby, and a childhood that shaped one of the kindest men Hollywood ever produced. Dan Blocker was born on December 10, 1928, in DeKalb, Texas, and weighed in at a reported 14 pounds at birth. A detail that followed him his entire life, half joke and half legend. The first sign that this was a man destined to be larger than the world around him. His family soon settled in O'Donnell, a small farming town in West Texas, where his parents ran a modest grocery store. It was there, among flour sacks and produce crates, that young Dan learned the values that would define him: hard work, humility, and treating every customer, rich or poor, with the same respect. By the time he was a boy, his size had already become part of his identity. Neighbors nicknamed him Big Un. He worked construction jobs and hauled grain alongside grown men before he was even a teenager, and by the time he reached his early teens, he stood well over 6 feet tall. In a small town, a boy that size draws attention, some of it unwanted. Local toughs occasionally tried to test him, hoping to make a name for themselves by beating the biggest kid in town. According to family recollections passed down over the years, Dan rarely started those fights, and he rarely lost them either. But what people who knew him then remembered wasn't his strength, it was his restraint. He didn't use his size to intimidate. He used it, when he had to protect. That instinct, the reluctant giant who fights only when someone smaller needs defending, wasn't something a screenwriter invented for Hoss Cartwright years later. It was already there, in a dusty West Texas town, long before Hollywood ever knew his name. Dan's size made him a natural athlete, and after high school he enrolled at what was then Sul Ross State Teachers College, later playing football and eventually attracting a scholarship. Standing well over 6 feet and weighing close to 300 pounds by his college years, he was an imposing figure on any field. Coaches saw a future in professional football. Dan saw something else. It started, as these things often do, almost by accident. The college drama department needed someone strong enough to move heavy set pieces, and Dan's size made him the obvious volunteer. But standing backstage, watching actors transform into other people right in front of him, something shifted. He asked to read for a small part. He got it, and by his own later accounts, that first taste of performing changed the direction of his entire life. He switched his major from English to theater, turned down professional football interest, and set his sights instead on the stage. That decision eventually took him to New York, where he studied and performed in productions that included Shakespeare's King Lear, a serious, demanding role for a young actor still finding his footing. It was there, testing himself against classical material, that Dan Blocker began to develop the range that would later let him play Hoss as more than just a big, friendly face. He knew how to find real emotion in a character, because he had trained to find it in the hardest material available. But before Hollywood came calling, history had other plans for him. In the early 1950s, Dan Blocker was drafted into the United States Army and sent to Korea, where he served as an infantry sergeant. His unit saw combat during some of the war's most brutal fighting, including engagements near the front lines in the harsh winter of 1951 and into the following year. For a man who stood well over 6 feet tall and weighed close to 300 pounds, even basic equipment was a challenge. Stories from those who served alongside him described the difficulty simply finding boots and uniforms that fit his frame. The realities of combat left a permanent mark on him. He was wounded in action and received a Purple Heart, a recognition he reportedly spoke about rarely, and without pride in violence. Only pride in having done his duty and looked out for the men beside him. What stayed with him wasn't a taste for heroism. It was a hatred of what war actually costs. In interviews later in his life, he spoke candidly about opposing military interventions built on force rather than necessity, and he was particularly outspoken about the human cost of modern warfare's most devastating weapons. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. The actor millions of Americans would come to know as the gentlest member of the Cartwright family had, in real life, survived close combat, been wounded defending his fellow soldiers, and come home determined to spend the rest of his life building instead of fighting. That contrast, soldier and gentle giant, wasn't a contradiction to the people who knew him. It was the same man, responding to violence by choosing, deliberately, to be kind. When Dan returned from Korea, he married his college sweetheart, Dolphia Parker, and the two began building a family that would eventually include 4 children. He pursued graduate studies in theater, eventually enrolling at UCLA, and it was during this period in California that his path toward Hollywood opened up. Television in the 1950s was hungry for Western talent, and Dan's commanding size, warm drawl, and natural stage training made him a near-perfect fit for the genre. He began picking up small parts in some of the era's most popular Western series: Gunsmoke, Cold Point 45, The Rifleman, Have Gun, Will Travel, and Maverick among them. These weren't leading roles. They were the kind of steady, unglamorous work that lets an actor learn a craft one scene at a time. Dan took each one seriously, and by 1957 he'd earned a more substantial part on The Restless Gun, followed by a recurring role as Tiny Buetinger, a good-natured ranch hand on Cimarron City. It was in that role that his gift for warmth and comic timing really started to show through, the same qualities that would soon make him famous. Then, in 1959, came the role that would define the rest of his life. When Bonanza premiered, few could have predicted it would become one of the most beloved series in American television history. At its center was the Cartwright family, patriarch Ben Cartwright and his 3 sons, each raised by a different mother, each representing a different kind of man. Adam was the thoughtful one, Little Joe was the impulsive romantic, and Hoss, played by Dan Blocker, was the biggest of them all, and somehow also the tenderest. Hoss wasn't written as the sharpest of the brothers, but audiences didn't love him despite that. They loved him because of his heart. He was loyal without condition, kind without calculation, and fiercely protective of anyone he considered family. A group that, on screen, seemed to expand every season to include half the Nevada territory. Children in particular adored him, sensing correctly that here was a giant who would never, ever hurt them. Dan later spoke about drawing inspiration for the character from the writings of Stephen Grellet, an 18th-century Quaker missionary remembered for urging people to do all the good they can, by all the means they can, for as long as they can. That philosophy wasn't just something Dan recited for interviews. Those who worked with him described a man who lived it. Though Hoss was portrayed as simple, Dan himself held a master's degree in theater and was known among cast and crew as a thoughtful, well-read man with a genuine interest in philosophy and literature. The gap between the character's simplicity and the actor's intelligence never seemed to bother him. If anything, it let him play Hoss with more compassion, because he understood that being good-hearted and being clever are 2 entirely different gifts. Off-screen, Dan formed a close bond with his co-stars, particularly Michael Landon, who played Little Joe. The friendship was real enough that Dan stood as best man at Landon's wedding, not the kind of gesture actors make for co-workers they merely tolerate. During his years on Bonanza, Dan also took occasional film roles, including appearances alongside Frank Sinatra. But television remained where his heart was, and Nevada's fictional Ponderosa Ranch remained his professional home for the rest of his career. Success never seemed to change Dan's core values, and one story from the height of Bonanza's popularity illustrates that better than any interview ever could. While the cast was traveling for location filming in the American South during the 1960s, at a time when segregation still governed which businesses would serve black customers, the production arrived at a hotel that refused to accommodate the show's black cast and crew members. Dan didn't hesitate. He informed the hotel that if his colleagues weren't welcome, none of the cast would be staying there. It wasn't a calculated publicity move. There was no press present to record it. No reason to do it except that it was the right thing to do. That instinct showed up again in a 1964 interview, when Dan was asked about his size and his temperament. His answer was blunt. He said he hated a bully worse than almost anything, and that despite being a big man who didn't enjoy fighting, if he saw someone using their size to hurt someone smaller, he would step in without a second thought. It's a small quote, but it says everything about how Dan understood his own physical presence, not as a tool for intimidation, but as a responsibility to protect people who needed it. On a lighter note, Dan was equally famous among friends and colleagues for his enormous appetite, an appropriately larger-than-life trait for a man of his size. Cast and crew told stories for years about breakfasts that could have fed a small family, and a particular fondness for hearty, old-fashioned Texas cooking, roasted meats, fresh bread, and homemade desserts above all. That love of food eventually became a business venture. Dan became a co-owner of the Ponderosa Steakhouse chain, a restaurant concept that borrowed its name directly from the Cartwright family ranch. Keeping his on-screen frame consistent with Hollywood's expectations required real discipline, and by the later seasons of the show, he sometimes relied on wardrobe padding to maintain the look audiences expected. A small, human detail behind a very large legend. By the early 1970s, fame had become something Dan tolerated rather than sought. He loved acting, but the loss of privacy that came with being one of the most recognizable faces on American television wore on him. Even simple family trips could turn into public spectacles, as fans recognized him anywhere he went. In 1970, inspired partly by photographs he'd seen of the Swiss Lake country, Dan and his family relocated to Switzerland, drawn by the promise of quieter surroundings and strong international schooling for his children. Some assumed the move signaled financial trouble, but Dan was direct in dismissing that idea. Bonanza had made him a wealthy man, and the decision to live abroad was about seeking peace, not escaping debt. In Switzerland, where the show aired dubbed in German, he found something close to real anonymity for the first time in over a decade. Even from across the Atlantic, though, he remained committed to the show and continued flying back to the United States for filming. He never fully stepped away from Hoss. He simply found a way to carry the role without letting it consume every part of his life. In May of 1972, Dan Blocker underwent what was expected to be a routine surgery to remove his gallbladder after being diagnosed with gallstones. The procedure itself appeared successful, and for a brief moment his family believed the worst was behind them. Then complications arose. A pulmonary embolism, a sudden blood clot, took his life on May 13, 1972, at Daniel Freeman Hospital in Inglewood, California. He was 43 years old. The news devastated fans across the country and shook the entertainment industry. Dan hadn't just played a beloved character. He had, by every account from those who worked with him, embodied many of that character's best qualities in real life. Tributes poured in honoring not just his talent, but his warmth, his humor, and his generosity. In the aftermath, a strange piece of folklore emerged and has persisted for decades. The claim that Dan's large frame required a piano crate in place of a standard casket. It's a colorful story, and an understandable one given how larger-than-life Dan was in the public imagination, but it isn't true. Dan Blocker was laid to rest in a standard casket at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, California. The myth says more about how much people wanted him to remain extraordinary, even in death, than it does about the actual facts of his passing. Losing a central cast member mid-run presents any television production with an impossible question. How do you continue a story that was built, in part, around a person who no longer exists? The Bonanza writers, led in this instance by Michael Landon, chose not to explain Hoss's absence directly on screen. Instead, the first episodes filmed after Dan's death let his absence sit in the silence between characters. Grief conveyed not through exposition, but through the empty space at the family dinner table where Hoss used to sit. Ratings had already been softening before Dan's passing, and losing him accelerated the show's decline. NBC eventually moved Bonanza out of its long-held Sunday night slot, and without Hoss's warmth anchoring the Cartwright family, the show struggled to recapture its earlier magic. It was canceled in 1973 after 14 seasons, a long, successful run by any measure, but one that fans and cast alike agree was never quite the same in its final chapter. Dan himself had reportedly sensed, even during the show's peak years, that nothing lasts forever in television, predicting in interviews that rising costs and the sheer volume of episodes would eventually catch up with the series. He turned out to be right, though not in the way anyone would have wanted. Dirk Blocker was still a young man when his father died, and losing him at such a pivotal age left a lasting mark, not just on his personal life, but on the choices he made in his own long-acting career. Dirk has spoken over the years about watching his father navigate constant public recognition, unable to go anywhere without fans gathering around him, and how that experience steered Dirk toward character work rather than leading man fame. He wanted the craft without the spotlight that had followed his father everywhere.